Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock flavoured podcast. On this show, Allister Thompson puts down his guitar and joins me in Derry and Toms so we can take a look at The Land That Time Forgot, the Edgar Rice Burroughs story, the 70s movie scripted by Mike and James Cawthron, the sequel, and the Asylum Studios remake from 2009. Edgar Rice Burroughs is a titan of pulp. Tarzan, the Barsoom series, being the adventures of John Carter on the Red Planet kicked off with A Princess of Mars, the Amtor series, the adventures of Carson set on Venus, the Pellucidar novels that started with At the Earth's Core and that eventually crossed over with Tarzan, very Moorcock, and the Caspak trilogy, of course, of which The Land That Time Forgot was just the first of three, sort of, amongst many other things. But who was he? I've decided to risk two strained wrists again and pull down John Clute and Peter Nichols' ridiculously massive encyclopedia of science fiction off the shelf to see what they have to say about him. And this entry, as you might expect, is absolutely enormous because he wrote a lot of stuff. But anyway, let's take a look at it. Burroughs, Edgar Rice, 1875 to 1950. US writer, educated at Michigan Military Academy. ERB served briefly in the US Cavalry. His early life was marked by numerous false starts and failures. At the time he started writing, aged 36, he was a pencil sharpener salesman. But it would seem that the impulse to create psychically charged, science fantasy environments was deep-set and powerful, for he began with a great rush of energy, and within 2 years has instigated 3 of his 4 most important series. A Princess of Mars, 1912, a fantastic solution to midlife frustrations, opens the Barsoom sequence of novels set on Mars, Barsoom, which established that planet as a venue for dreamlike and interminable sagas in which SF and fantasy protocols mix indiscriminately as a sort of enabling gear. Of ERB's non-series tales, perhaps the finest is The Land That Time Forgot, set in the lost world of Caspak near the South Pole and cunningly presenting in literal form, for animals here metamorphosed through evolutionary stages, the dictum that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. The book was loosely adapted into 2 films, The Land That Time Forgot and The People That Time Forgot. Well, I'm not going to go into the meanings of ontogeny and phylogeny. I'm just going to move on swiftly. It's often been said, it says, that ERB's works have small literary or intellectual merit. Nevertheless, because their lack of realistic reference frees them from time, because their efficient narrative style helps to compensate for their prudery and racism, and because ERB had a genius for the literalisation of the dream, they have endured. His rediscovery since the 1960s was an astonishing publishing phenomenon, with the majority of his books being reprinted regularly. ERB has probably had more imitators than any other SF writer, ranging from Otis Adelbert Klein in the 1930s to Kenneth Bulmer writing as Alan Burt Akers in the 1970s, with even a much later writer like Terry Bisson homaging him in Voyage to the Red Planet in 1990. And thus it continues for another 8 million pages, so we'll just stop there. Burroughs stories were quickly translated to film with the Tarzan property, which now totals 100 films or more since 1918, and numerous TV shows, and actually the TV episodes of Tarzan series are well over 200 as well. And as a kid, Ron Ely, in a way, was my Tarzan, but he had to compete with Johnny Weissmuller because both of those things were regulars on British TV. But as we know, it took until the 2000s for a Barsoom film to finally appear. But back in the 70s, the UK film studio Amicus made 3 Burroughs adaptations, including The Land That Time Forgot. Now, on the film, I'm essentially a lazy sod, so I'm just going to read bits from my 2012 article, which I wrote for The Quietus, to coincide with the Studio Canal DVD release. And it reads, "You may not remember Doug McClure from a whole slew of American B-movie westerns, TV shows, and beer commercials. However, if you're British and aged 30 or over, you almost certainly will remember him from a handful of period films involving men in waistcoats battling poorly realised dinosaurs and other beasties that were the mainstays of Saturday and Sunday afternoon television throughout the 1980s and early 90s. Despite having an extensive career in TV and film in the United States, as demonstrated by his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, it was these low-budget British flicks which burned McClure into the minds of UK audiences. The most prolific examples of Amicus's output, and a specialty of the studio, was a series of horror anthologies that exploited the formula established by the 1945 classic Ealing production Dead of Night, in which an overarching narrative bookends a short series of seemingly unconnected episodes featuring high-profile British and often American character actors experiencing spooky or otherwise terrifying goings-on, finally revealing a suitable, gratifying twist. Although they undoubtedly beat the portmanteau horse to death after the success in 1964 of their first effort, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, studio owners Milton Subotsky and Max Rosenberg were nevertheless prepared to gamble on innovations. Early in the decade, they obtained the rights to produce two colourful adaptations of Doctor Who television stories, Doctor Who and the Daleks in 1965 and Daleks Invasion Earth 2150 AD in 1966. On the horror front, the partners were similarly not afraid to attempt to break new ground, most notably in The Beast Must Die in 1974, a whodunit featuring a gimmick called the Werewolf Break. During this short interval, the audience are invited to reflect upon the film so far and form a judgment as to which character has been transforming into a rather playful German Shepherd. In the mid-70s, Amicus embarked upon a short series of Edgar Rice Burroughs adaptations that would prove to be their swan song as a studio, before the British film industry, Hammer included, largely closed up shop in the face of the new wave of American cinema, science fiction, and horror movies in particular. The first was The Land That Time Forgot, Burroughs' tale of the survivors of a U-boat attack in World War I who turned the table on their antagonist by hijacking the submarine. Following a tense standoff and some shenanigans between the German crew and our heroes, the U-boat arrives at a mysterious island populated by prehistoric beasts and primitive tribes, where the laws of nature are subverted. Adventure, of course, ensues. The Land That Time Forgot was a milestone in British adventure cinema for a few reasons, not least of which was that, for the first time, homegrown pictures were visibly starting to creak under the strain of competition from across the Atlantic. 1975 was the year of Jaws. Edgar Rice Burroughs' stories had been sources for cinematic adaptation for almost 60 years, but almost every product was Tarzan-related. Amicus's film was the first major attempt to capture something other than the exploits of the loincloth-clad hollering jungle VIP, who by this time had departed markedly in character from the source material. It was also the company's first venture involving Doug McClure, and so successful was this collaboration that he'd appear in 3 more Amicus movies, 2 being further ERB adaptations. The fourth, final, and only non-ERB-based Amicus McClure monster mashup was nevertheless heavily influenced by Burroughs. In Warlords of Atlantis, in 1978, a turn of the 20th century expedition in a diving bell leads McClure and his companions to be dragged into the depths by a giant octopus and emerge on the shores of lost Atlantis. Put to slavery by the advanced Atlanteans, they battle giant beasts, naturally, lead an uprising and escape, only to face treachery from within their own ranks. Warlords of Atlantis was penned by a stalwart of British television, Brian Hales. Hales wrote extensively for not only Doctor Who, but also Doomwatch, Z-Cars, and the long-running radio serial The Archers. In contrast, The Land That Time Forgot was the first, and to date only, film screenplay written by the legendary British fantasist Michael Moorcock. Following the release of Robert West's suitably wacky, but sadly unfaithful adaptation of Moorcock's seminal novel The Final Programme in 1973, Moorcock was distraught and decided, in conjunction with longtime friend and collaborator James Cawthron, to get involved in the filmmaking process. Moorcock was at the height of his creative powers. Already a recipient of the Nebula Award for Behold the Man, as well as numerous other accolades, he was turning out best-selling fantasy at an almost industrial rate. An Edgar Rice Burroughs adaptation was a natural fit for Moorcock. Although he was responsible for the subversion of numerous fantasy tropes throughout the 60s, he was inspired enormously by Burroughs' John Carter books as a child, Gods of Mars in particular. In fact, his earliest series, the Cain of Old Mars trilogy, was a shameless John Carter pastiche penned under the pseudonym Edward P. Bradbury. Moorcock was hired and given the authority by Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated to write a faithful adaptation of the source novel. Unfortunately, the lack of budget on the monster front and the wishes of the producer to insert genre staples like volcanoes left Moorcock somewhat dissatisfied with the result. So, sit back in your hastily constructed hammock, watch out for wobbly dinosaurs throughout, of course, and hope you don't metamorphose into your next stage of existence before you get through listening to Allister and me talk about The Land That Time Forgot. We're back in Derry and Toms, and our year of threes continues because Allister Thompson is back in Derry and Toms for the 3rd time. Been a bit of a year of this, but welcome back, Allister.
Thank you very much. I'm ecstatic to be here.
Oh, good. I'm really delighted to have you back. What have you been up to?
Well, people who have heard me on this podcast before know that I'm an incredibly prolific musician with a small but devoted audience. So I've continued to churn out almost monthly recordings since part of what I do is ambient music. And while ambient music has its own, it's not easy to make necessarily in terms of knowing what to do, what sounds good. It doesn't take that very long to make a lengthy piece of ambient music compared with arranging a whole, song. So it enabled me to be even more prolific. So I've been doing a bit of that, but I also released an album of traditional British folk music, which, you were kind enough to listen to, I believe. I've written a second novel, which is not a sequel to The Music of the Spheres, which is the one that we talked about several years ago. I've written a bit of cli-fi, which is that's what they call the genre now. It's the biggest science fiction genre of the day is cli-fi, because we're also frightened of climate change. Yeah. So I've written a novel in that area, but one that I hope is a bit different, a bit more of a novel of ideas, and less about cannibals, the things that other people put into their their post-apocalyptic fiction. And I have found a small Canadian publisher who is going to put it out for me next year. So I'm quite excited about that.
Oh, fantastic. Can you give us the elevator pitch other than cli-fi?
Well, in the year 2123, a young member of a utopian community that's based on gathering knowledge from, the pre-fall world that we live in now, gathering together that knowledge so that human beings can start using it properly in a more holistic way. So it's sort of it's like a deep ecological concept where we've destroyed ourselves because we're not being good citizens of the world, which what we know this is true. And so the surviving humans need to act in accordance with nature, live in companionship with nature, I guess. And so this member of this utopian community is sent out on his first mission to go and find scraps of this knowledge down, the main highway that runs down Ontario, which is where I live. And along the way, he runs, of course, into various dangers and is, I'm not going to give too much away, but, runs into people who are more into the idea of reestablishing the bad old world rather than trying to find a new way to live. So there's bits of adventure, but there's a lot of discussion about how we've come to this point and what it's going to be leading to, particularly as pertains to political and sociological change, because we hear a lot about climate, but we don't hear about the political and social effects, like the rise of authoritarian regimes that we're seeing right now, that is going to lead to climate refugees being kept in concentration camps and all these things that are coming down the pipeline within the next 20 years or so. That's all viewed as a past event by my characters. So it's speculative in that way. So, but for all of that, the people who have read it so far have told me that it's surprisingly hopeful in tone. So that made me happy because I'm not known for that.
I think something like that is needed. All of the best post-apocalyptic or speculative fiction is about contemporary fears, isn't it? And
it is. Yeah.
Actually, funnily enough, contemporary fears probably fed somewhat into the writing of the novel that we're going to talk about. I say novel; it's more of a novella because it's very short, isn't it? But we'll get to that in a second.
A trilogy of them that he wrote. I saw. Yes.
Well, apparently. I mean, everybody's seen the title of this podcast and probably listened to the introduction, I'm sure. So we're talking about The Land That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs. I can't remember why we chose this. I think it was just because I wanted to do it. Because, we occasionally wander away from Moorcock. And, of course, he didn't write The Land That Time Forgot, but he wrote the screenplay along with James Cawthron of the Amicus movie from the 1970s, which was a Sunday afternoon staple or a Saturday afternoon staple for me as a kid. It's like burned into my brain almost. And so we decided to do this, and I thought, we might get into some of the weeds about what some of the contemporary fears were for people like Edgar Rice Burroughs when it came to things like race theory.
Well, yes, I learned a lot about while I was researching to do this. I can't say I was surprised. I mean, those were common views for people at that time, but at the same time, it does take a bit of the luster off of it, doesn't it? We'll get into that. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is why, in many ways, I appreciate the film so much. But yeah, we'll get to these points. But going back to your book, I'll definitely be a first day buy for me because I love the music of the Spheres so much. But also, I really like this type of fiction. And, I think probably the last time climate-driven fiction was really super popular was probably the late 60s and 70s. But all of that was really dark and cynical and gloomy. And I'm one of those rare people out there, for example, and I'm not comparing your work to this by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just trying to make a point about how sometimes I really appreciate something that's optimistic. I really like The Postman. The Postman, the Kevin Costner film.
Right.
Because it's a post-apocalyptic movie. It's ever so slightly goofy, but it's got a really kind of positive drive that runs through it about, the settlements that he visits in that. They just want to make everything good and they want to make everything better and they're happy to pay him what they pay him to do bad Shakespeare. And, it's a film that's always entertained me, that purely because had that film had a 70s cynical streak to it, I don't think I would have liked it, but I like it because it's sort of almost goofily positive and optimistic about these things.
Well, yeah, I mean that's needed because, like I said, I mean, I was joking, but how many things have you read or seen where it's a post-apocalyptic scenario and one of the first things people start doing is eating each other? Like, this is actually something that's like we can't snare a squirrel or something. We can't grow some beans. First thing we're going to do is start eating each other because that's one of those great taboos and it's very lurid. And, so, I mean, I keep seeing things like that, whether it's, The Walking Dead or The Last of Us or, novels that I've read and edited because, as you know, I'm an editor. And it's one of the, there's a certain horrific things. And what these things do is they excite the reader, but they take away from the seriousness of the topic. And the fact that we're supposed to be discussing ideas and possibilities here, but no, it's not going to be always the horror elements all the time. So I got irritated by that, and that was one of the reasons I wrote the novel.
Speaking as somebody who can't garden and is too slow and clumsy to hunt, I probably would end up eating people, but that's just my own personal failing. And actually, I'm more likely to be eaten, though, to be fair, because I'm fat, I'm a slow runner. And if it came to fights, other than hiding behind sandbags and trying to trade my whiskey collection for tins of dog food, I think my life would be a complete disaster.
We won't know. We will not know until it happens. Something might come out in you, some beast. We don't know.
Yeah. I'd probably, maintain a recipe book or something to try and make people's cannibalism ever so slightly more gourmet or something.
Spice them up a bit,
Yeah. We've got a good cupboard full of spices. So, between spices and whiskey and Phil's wine cellar, I say cellar, rack, would probably do all right. But, of course, all they need to do is kick the door down, eat us, and then they can have it all free anyway. So, but you know what? I'll worry about that when the apocalypse actually happens. So anyway, we're already off on various digressions, but we decided to talk about The Land That Time Forgot. Now, it's interesting. You've already pointed out this is a trilogy, and of course, originally when he wrote The Land That Time Forgot, it was the reverse of a fix-up novel, really. It was a one overall story that ended up splitting into three, and of course, like most of his stuff, it was all serialized. But when I started looking at Edgar Rice Burroughs and where this fell within his oeuvre, for want of a better expression. So it's published in 1918. But by this time, he's already 5 deep into his Tarzan series. He's written 4 John Carter stories, 2 Pellucidar novels, all in 6 years, starting in 1912. So he's on this massively crazy productive roll already, and he's still probably only in his late 20s or early 30s at this point.
I saw that he started writing at the age of 36.
Oh, right. So he's probably in his early 40s then.
Needing money. Yeah. he had struck out of some jobs and he needed to make money. It's ironic that back in... I mean, think about that 100 years ago. That was actually a way you could think of to generate income, as opposed to now, where it's it's an invitation to poverty to be a writer now.
And all of the pulp writers did these things, churned these things out at a rate of 2 cents per word.
Exactly.
At a rate of knots for the pulp magazines, Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith and Lovecraft and all these authors were all banging this stuff out. But I think Burroughs is interesting because he was so prolific. And I think as well as that, as well as having in 6 years from 1912 to 1918 when this is published, not even talking about his short stories, he's got 19 or more books of tales or stories. Not just the Tarzan and John Carter books, but some other things as well. But Tarzan and John Carter already, 6 years into his writing career, he's created two massive 20th century touchstones of heroic fantasy and science fiction. And probably outside of people who enjoy the film The Land That Time Forgot or are hardcore Burroughs fans, The Land That Time Forgot isn't really that well known, or you certainly don't find it in many second-hand bookshops. You don't tend to see it talked about in the same breaths as Tarzan and John Carter. And it's incredible, really. I mean, he was obviously a massive influence and inspiration to Moorcock, of course, who came close to that level of prodigiousness in his 20s in the 1960s. But it's also amazing to think that The Land That Time Forgot is published in the year that the first silent Tarzan film is released as well. So as well as knocking out all these books, he also, the first silent Tarzan film was really successful. So he suddenly becomes part of the cultural zeitgeist quite early in his career. It's incredible, really. And, interesting character, I think, is probably the best way of describing him, because, as you say, he came to this certainly it wasn't his initial calling, for sure, but to explode into the culture with all of these books and suddenly becoming responsible for the first cinematic franchise so quickly is quite incredible.
He became the most successful of that whole crew of serialized writers because of Tarzan. And
yeah.
I never made this connection before, to him and the suburb of Los Angeles, Tarzana, but it made sense when I heard that, it grew up around his ranch that he built with his fortune that he got from Tarzan. So, there's an interesting discrepancy between the success that he enjoyed and some of those contemporaries you mentioned. I mean, Ashton Smith lived in like a little cabin or something, and he could barely make ends meet throughout his life. And here's Burroughs, living the life of luxury because of that. Tarzan was very successful, but it was also because of that nascent film industry that he managed to connect with, and Tarzan becoming one of the first pop culture sensations, I guess.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable, really. It was kind of like a model for a lot of these modern authors. Like I said, modern. Stephen King's been around donkey's years, but these people have been around for a long time. Who, I mean, when you think about modern authors who are in any way even vaguely comparable in terms of the sheer volume of work that's been made from their material. I mean, obviously, it took John Carter, Princess of Mars wasn't made until, 2014 or 13 or whenever it was, despite numerous attempts at trying to get it off the ground. Funnily enough, Amicus, who made the Land That Time Forgot movie, they wanted to do that in the 70s as well, but they ended up doing The People That Time Forgot instead and hoped that they would get the money. But then Star Wars happened. So the idea of doing a planet-spanning adventure after Star Wars came out kind of ruined old school special effects and the kind of work that people were doing on Land That Time Forgot forever, and the world just completely moved on.
It does sort of underscore that the just how radical the Star Wars special effects were at the time. When you compare the special effects in most science fiction movies, I mean, there was bigger budget stuff like 2001, which is spectacular for when it came out. But the average science fiction or fantasy movie had very, very low budget. What are to us now laughable special effects. But Star Wars changed the whole playing field for that.
Yeah, so Star Wars brings 2001 production values to space adventure and and space opera and genre pulp, because Star Wars is a pulp adventure, isn't it? Really?
Oh, very much so. The space opera of the lowest kind.
Yeah. Not only that, I mean, we should probably get this out there up front. Because of what we did with War of the Worlds, we've done something similar here. We're going to talk about the book, and we're going to talk about some movie adaptations. And one of them, which I just happened to come across, so I sent you a link to it, was the sequel, The People That Time Forgot. That came out the same year as Alien.
Yeah. Well, I should actually be angry with you for inflicting that upon me, because I did watch it all the way through.
Yeah.
So, yeah. That's an hour and a half I'll never get back.
Yeah, yeah, we'll get to that. There are elements of that I really do appreciate, but yeah, it's a poor second to the land that time forgot.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll get to that when we get to that. So, what's the basic concept of this book? So we've got this mysterious island or lost world trope, which again, I mean, he didn't invent this trope because Jules Verne got there first with Les Mystères. Probably completely butchered that pronunciation. Mysterious Island, which was. I mean, funny when you think about these things, Jules Verne was creating his own mini shared universe with some of his novels as well, because that was a semi-sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and another book, the name of which I forget, because Captain Nemo pops up in it towards the end. And there's a film adaptation of that as well by Cy Endfield, the guy who did Zulu, strangely enough. And I did pick up the Blu-ray last week, but I've not had the chance to watch it. And H.G. Wells had already done The Island of Dr. Moreau. That's a slightly different proposition. Yeah, it's a guy shipwrecked on an island. But on the beast front, it does have some slight similarities plot point-wise with Mysterious Island, in that much of the development of the creatures on the island is guided by scientists, with Nemo on one hand and Moreau on the other. But this is a true, white man washes up on distant shore and experiences monsters, dinosaurs, various other things. And so this is 1918 when he publishes this. He's already popular. People are already reading his Tarzan and Barsoom novels in droves and absorbing it all. And I contend that this book, despite not having a film adaptation until almost 60 years later, unlike the 7 years it took for Tarzan to reach the screen, go with me for a moment on this. By 1932, there have been 8 silent Tarzan films. And that year that this is published, the very first talkie with Johnny Weissmuller is released in cinemas. Massively popular. So the first thing is there anybody comparable to Burroughs when it comes to a popular author being translated to screen so prolifically even now, let alone back then? But it's a known phenomenon. As a result, not just for pulp readers, but his work is already out there in that cultural zeitgeist because of the success of the Tarzan movies. Then in 1933, along comes what is arguably, or what will arguably become the greatest and best known Mysterious Island movie of all time. One that jettisons Burroughs' pseudo-scientific elements about a biome, accelerated evolutionary cycle, and just goes with Westerners arriving by ship on the shores of a mysterious island and encountering primitive humans, monsters, dinosaurs, perils, terrible deaths. King Kong. King Kong arrives in 1933, takes this mysterious island thing and makes it an absolute cultural touchstone. I don't know, is there anything to that? Maybe, maybe not. Because one of the things I read when I was looking at King Kong was that the producer of The Rat admitted that his inspiration for that was actually a silent movie that had been released, which was about people encountering, I think it was something like a tribe of apes, and the reason why nobody talks about it anymore and why it's just not seen anymore is because it had scenes of apes, men in ape suits mating with black African women and producing apes. So yeah, there's a very good reason. But it was hugely popular, and the producer of King Kong thought, women in peril plus gorillas equals money.
I wouldn't be surprised, though, if the Burroughs stories were in their minds as well, because Burroughs was, I mean, he wasn't adapted much to film beyond a certain point, say post-World War II. He was a little bit forgotten other than Tarzan, but at the time when he was doing these books, he was very popular to the point where there's this famous quote by Ray Bradbury, in saying that he was possibly the most influential writer of his time because of the way he inspired young boys with these stories. And probably girls too, but Bradbury didn't mention them. But that indicates that there was a time when you were starting to read, and you were starting, read more grown-up stories. Burroughs would have been the person whose book you were reaching for. So, this may not have been the most popular of Burroughs' books, but I'm sure it's sold its copies in the day and influenced a lot of filmmakers and other writers. Like you can definitely see the influence of the first 2 of these Caspak novels. That's the trilogy. Yeah. On At the Mountains of Madness by Lovecraft. Unquestionably, there's an influence there. And Lovecraft admired Burroughs, and they may even have corresponded. Lovecraft corresponded with all his pulpy friends So yeah, I mean, this is probably a far more influential little book than you'd think.
Yeah. At the Mountains of Madness is another great example, isn't it? Because there was something so romantic at this time in history about how we had circumnavigated the globe, but there were still no satellites and flight was in its infancy. So undiscovered mysteries were still out there, and there was a degree of plausibility to this kind of thing. The core of all the mysterious island or the lost civilization, like at the Mountains of Madness, they're all just fantastic examples of this. And yeah, it must have had a big impact on how people thought about, the possibilities of adventure novels and adventure stories. Because of course, we'd have things like King Solomon's Mines and all those other things which were about chasing, mythical but more known and tangible stuff. But hell, when you think about even today, the Mysterious Island thing, and the King Kong thing. I mean, Kong Skull Island is a perfect example of a really well executed Mysterious Island movie that is basically The Land That Time Forgot, but with Vietnam era American soldiers instead of German U-boatmen and British sailors. It's all very, very similar. I've got to say, big fan of Skull Island. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Some really nasty deaths. Looks great. Good stuff. But not only that, I mean, even the second Jurassic Park film is a Mysterious Island movie. Yeah, it's still here. And funnily enough, there's a guy on YouTube who's done a playlist of like Mysterious Island stroke, Lost Continent type films and TV shows, and there's over 100 videos on that playlist. A lot of it is like weird Brazilian TV shows and things like that, but it's, there's so much of it out there. And only earlier on, I was just cycling through a bit of TV between reading, waiting for Phil to get back. And there's a TV channel in the UK called Legend, which just largely shows old movies in low res, and they look pretty crappy. But there was a Kenneth More adaptation of, I don't think it was Journey to the Centre of the Earth, but it was one of those stories. It was one of the Jules Verne stories. Kenneth More in it, and the whole rest of the cast were either Spanish or Italian or something like that. He was dubbing his own voice, but everybody else you could tell had been dubbed, so it was a Spanish or an Italian production, again, of the same thing. So people have been making these movies for such a long time because they're so interesting.
The low budget world is full of them. I remember watching I was on, when I got Tubi, which is free and has ads. So it was a Spanish adaptation of The Shadow over Innsmouth under a different name.
Really?
And they had hired some young American guy. I think he was best known for some soap opera or something. Yeah. And the rest of the cast were all these Spanish people. And it was
is that Dagon?
Unbelievable bad. Yeah, I think that's what they called it. Yeah.
Dagon, yeah. But, that's the Stuart Gordon movie. Yeah.
It was basically The Shadow over Innsmouth, and it was just unbelievably terrible.
I'm really fond of that film.
Because so this is the same one where there's a pit in the basement, and they're going to throw people in there to, Cthulhu is down there, and at one point they strip off some guy's entire skin. They remove his skin while he's alive.
Yeah, the old drunk guy. Yeah,
you liked that.
Yeah, because I just love Stuart Gordon movies. I love shonky, like, violent.
I've forgotten that he did that in Spain. That was him. Yeah,
yeah. So Stuart Gordon and Brian Usner formed a film studio called Fantastic Factory, and they located it in Spain and used Spanish crews, Spanish actors, and they got a lot of films done, a lot cheaper than they could make them in America. So Dagon, screenplay by Dennis Powley, I think, who wrote the screenplays for From Beyond and Reanimator, and
which are those are good films. I like those. So I'm not dissing their entire oeuvre here. It's just that one. I couldn't believe how cheap it seemed.
Well, I tell you what, when you watch that, I've got the Blu-ray. when you watch that in HD, some of the practical creature effects are actually fantastic. But I think it's one of those films that really suffers from being on a crappy VHS pan and scan that's then been interpolated to a TV broadcast. And there is some terrible dubbing. And the main guy, who is actually an English actor playing an American, is called Ezra Godden. Yeah, Ezra Godden. I don't think he's done a great deal else. He's done a little bit of British TV. He's not really very good in it because he's struggling with a bad American accent the entire time, and he's acting panicked. Is particularly terrible.
Yes.
But I really like that film. But then, even Stuart Gordon's worst movies, I'm always really, really fond of. Which weirdly, I've actually got a note about Stuart Gordon further down. Weird coincidence, because when you talk about watching low-budget tat, there seems to be a pattern that we're falling into since War of the Worlds, where when we get together to talk about something, we end up watching a C. Thomas Howell Asylum movie. And we've done it again.
Yes.
We've done it again. But you know what? We'll get to that. So, this book. So, it's written in first person by a guy called Bowen Tyler. And what really surprised me when I first picked this up was how its opening passages, very contemporary for the time, and initially really, really grounded. Because you've got this propulsive, disturbing narrative about a U-boat attack on a civilian liner, and women and children and men all essentially drowning, dying in the water. It's all quite disturbing and harsh, but really well written, I thought. For a guy who's only been writing 6 years and is writing about Tarzan and Mars, this is probably one of the most grounded things I expect is ever written up till this point.
I would say
impressive.
One of the things that I was immediately struck by when I started reading it, and I hadn't read this before, was how good the writing was. Burroughs was actually a really good prose stylist, and like really, really polished. Like some of his contemporaries, like I love Lovecraft. I read him all the time. But there's certain little peccadillos, little eccentricities that constantly crop up, overuse of certain words, and what there's the things that make Lovecraft. Burroughs is far more polished than that. And so I was impressed by that. And as you say, it starts with something very viscerally contemporary. And that whole opening stage of the book that deals with the U-boat and the conflicts between the two groups, before we ever get to any kind of crazy, island full of dinosaurs, is very compelling.
Once you get to the point where he's floating in the water, one of the differences between this and the film is that he's got a dog called Nob.
Right.
And sadly, Nob goes missing at the end of the book, and we never find out where Nob gets to. I'm hoping Nob makes some kind of heroic return in the people. It's
always the way in fiction with dogs. You're watching a horror movie and the family has a dog, and you go, we know who's going first. The poor doggy's going first. Yeah.
So I've got this, really grounded, quite alarming description. He's floating in the water, and he comes across a young woman who's also floating along there as well. And we get one of the features of Burroughs' heroes is that within about 30 seconds of seeing her in the water, he's in love with her because she's a woman and she's there. But let's have a look. It says, so for the 1,000th time, I thank the strange fate which sent that lifeboat hurtling upwards from the green pit of destruction to which it had been dragged, sent it far up above the surface, emptying its water as it rose above the waves and dropping it upon the surface of the sea, buoyant and safe. It did not take me long to clamber over its side and drag Nobbs into comparative safety. Then I glanced around upon the scene of death and desolation which surrounded us. The sea was littered with wreckage among which floated the pitiful forms of women and children, buoyed up by their useless lifebelts. Some were torn and mangled, others lay rolling quietly to the motion of the sea, their countenances composed and peaceful. Others were set in hideous lines of agony or horror. Close to the boat's side floated the figure of a girl. Her face was turned upward, held above the surface by her lifebelt, and was framed in a floating mass of dark and waving hair. She was very beautiful. I had never looked upon such perfect features, such a divine moulding, which at the same time, human, intensely human. It was a face filled with character and strength and femininity, the face of one who was created to love and be loved. The cheeks were flushed to the hue of life and health and vitality, and yet she lay there upon the bosom of the sea, dead. I felt something rising my throat as I looked down upon that radiant vision, and swore that I should live to avenge her murder. And then I let my eyes drop once more to the face upon the water, and what I saw nearly tumbled me backwards into the sea, for the eyes in the dead face had opened, the lips had parted, and one hand was raised towards me, in a mute appeal for succour. She lived. She was not dead. I leaned over the boat's side and drew her quickly into the comparative safety which God had given me. I removed a lifebelt and my soggy coat and made a pillow for her head. I chafed her hands and arms and feet. I worked over her for an hour, and at last I was rewarded by a deep sigh, and again those great eyes opened and looked into mine. At that, I was all embarrassment. I've never been a ladies' man. At Leland Stanford I was the butt of the class because of my hopeless imbecility in the presence of a pretty girl, but the men liked me, nevertheless. I was rubbing one of her hands when she opened her eyes, and I dropped it as though it were a red-hot rivet. Those eyes took me in slowly from head to foot, then they wandered slowly around the horizon, marked by the rising and falling gunwales of the lifeboat. What? It's only a few pages old, and I'm already taken out of it just by how bizarre this is. He's floating amongst dead, dismembered women and children, and he sees a pretty girl, and he's like, "Oh, well, still my heart."
The irony is she spends most of the novel spurning his advances as well. So that's right. She dislikes him extremely, which is another difference between that and the film adaptation, where there's sort of a synergy between those two characters right from the beginning.
Yeah.
And of course, also being the 70s and Moorcock writing it.
Yeah.
He gives her a little more dignity than this character possesses.
Yeah, he certainly does. There are a few improvements he makes on this, and that is definitely one of them. And another one of the improvements is he removes the dangling subplot of the fact that she happens to be engaged to the Baron, who was captaining the U-boat that just sank that ship.
Yeah, they meet in the middle of the ocean by chance, and that was
what a weird
ridiculous
coincidence. Yeah. So Tyler instantly in love, and we do get a quite exciting U-boat heist because the U-boat surfaces to kill any survivors. This is another interesting difference with the film. The German U-boat crew and the captain are much more human and less cartoonishly evil in the film. But von Schoenwertz is a bit of a bugger in this book.
Yes.
He's not a very nice guy. So there's a U-boat heist. We get lots of action back and forth, which again we get in the film. We get some back and forth. Turns out there's a traitor aboard. Tyler, because she talks to the U-boat captain and spends time with him, thinks that she's the traitor straight away. She's called Miss LaRue, although most of the time he refers to her as the girl.
Yes.
Very rarely refers to her by name. And there's a situation where Tyler gets stranded on deck and the U-boat starts to submerge because of the actions of this traitor. And that's actually quite exciting as well, because there's a real sense of panic and danger with Tyler when he realises that he's in the middle of the Atlantic and the U-boat is just about to submerge on him, and he's really, really stuffed. But it turns out that the crew down below, the survivors down below actually serve his bacon, which is pretty handy, really, because otherwise he would have drowned terribly in the Atlantic. But again, there's this quite funny little bit which made me laugh, which I'm going to read out. It says, so he's just managed to get back into the conning tower, and it says, "When I got down into the centrale, I saw the Germans lined up on one side with a couple of my men, with pistols standing over them. Von Schoenwertz was among them. On the floor lay Benson, moaning, and beyond him stood the girl, a revolver in one hand. I looked about, bewildered. 'What's happened down here?' I asked. 'Tell me.' Bradley replied. 'You see the result, sir,' he said. 'It might have been a very different result but for Miss LaRue. We were all asleep. Benson had relieved the guard early in the evening. There was no one to watch him, no one but Miss LaRue. She felt the submergence of the boat and came out of her room to investigate. She was just in time to see Benson at the diving rudders. When he saw her, he raised his pistol and fired point blank at her, but he missed, and she fired and didn't miss. The two shots awakened everybody, and as our men were armed, the result was inevitable as you see it. But it would have been very different had it not been for Miss LaRue. It was she who closed the diving tank seacocks and roused Olsen and me, and had the pumps started to empty them. And there had I been thinking that through her machinations I had been lured to the deck and to my death. I could have gone on my knees to her and begged her forgiveness, or at least I could have, had I not been Anglo-Saxon. As I was, I could only remove my soggy cap and bow and mumble my appreciation. She made no reply, only turned and walked very rapidly towards the room. Could I have heard right? Was it really a sob that came floating back to me through the narrow aisle of the U-33? Benson died that night. He remained defiant almost to the last, but just before he went out he motioned to me, and I leaned over to catch the faintly whispered words. I did it alone, he said. I did it because I hate you. I hate all your kind. I was kicked out of your shipyard at Santa Monica. I was kicked out of California. I am an IWW. I became a German agent, not because I love them, for I hate them too, but because I wanted to injure Americans, who I hated more. I threw the wireless apparatus overboard. I destroyed the chronometer and the sextant. I devised a scheme for varying the compass to suit my wishes. I told Wilson that I had seen the girl talking with von Jonevorts, and I made the poor egg think he had seen her doing the same thing. I'm sorry. Sorry that my plans failed. I hate you. He didn't die for half an hour after that, nor did he speak again, aloud, but just a few seconds before he went to meet his maker, his lips moved in a faint whisper, and I leaned close to catch his words. What do you suppose I heard? Now I lay me down to sleep. That was all. Benson was dead. We threw his body overboard. It's fabulous. It's fabulous.
The evil working class there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anglo-Saxon grit got him
Yes.
through it. But it's amazing. Miss LaRue saves the day, and I don't think it's till one of the last chapters where she actually gets a paragraph of dialogue. She is just the girl who is desperately in love with and lusts after, and she is so undeveloped. And when she does start to get lines, she's in love with him as well. So it all works out.
Well,
It's
of
quite
course.
remarkable. It's of his time, but you've got to say, all that stuff, the sinking of the ship, the U-boat heist, the bit where he's trapped on the deck, it's masterful adventure writing. It's really exciting, and it's great. It's great stuff. But there's some other stuff that we'll come across, and we'll talk about that as we go, where there's probably some reservations that you can have reading this 112 years after it was published about some of where his brain was, perhaps, on certain things.
Definitely.
But they've been off course for days thanks to Benson. They're hopelessly lost, and it turns out he's poisoned the water tanks too, the bugger. What a fix. But they sight land. And this is again, I'm not going to read it, but the actual description when they find the island, I think, is absolutely fantastic. The little descriptions like calling it a repellent coast, because it's so hostile looking. But they realise that they've got no drinking water. They need to find a way into the interior of this island. They've no idea where they are because they're hopelessly lost because of the actions of Benson. They end up submerging the submarine to go through a channel and find themselves in a lagoon, but only after the narrator calls them cowards to try and get them to bend to his will. He says, you bunch of cowards, are we going to do this or not? And they go, oh, yeah, well, we will then, because we're what we call cowards.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so at this point, of course, we've got, I think it's 9 versus 9 on the rescued, I say rescued, the survivors.
Hijacked
the
sub.
U-boat. Because the fight on the U-boat deck is quite good with people getting shot and tumbling into the sea to die in the hostile waves and everything else. It's all good stuff. But there's a really, really nice description as well of when they find the way back in to the interior of the island. We're in the middle of a broad and now sluggish river, the banks of which were lined by giant arboraceous ferns, raising their mighty fronds 50, 100, 200 feet into the quiet air. Close by as something rose to the surface of the river and dashed at the periscope. I had a vision of wide, distended jaws, then all was blotted out. A shiver ran down into the tower as the thing closed upon the periscope. A moment later it was gone, and I could see again. Above the trees there soared into my vision a huge thing on bat-like wings, a creature as large as a large whale, but fashioned more after the order of a lizard. Then again something charged the periscope and blotted out the mirror. I will confess that I was almost gasping for breath as I gave the commands to emerge. Into what sort of strange land had fate guided us? The instant the deck was awash, I opened the conning tower hatch and stepped out. In another minute, the deck hatch lifted, and those who were not on duty below streamed up the ladder, Olsen bringing Nobbs under one arm. For several minutes, no one spoke. I think they must have each been as overcome by awe as was I. All about us was a flora and a fauna as strange and wonderful to us as might have been those upon a distant planet had we suddenly been miraculously transported through ether to an unknown world. Even the grass upon the near bank was unearthly. Lush and high it grew, and each blade bore upon its tip a brilliant flower, violet or yellow or carmine or blue, making as gorgeous a sward as human imagination could conceive. But the life, it teemed. The tall fern-like trees were alive with monkeys, snakes and lizards. Huge insects hummed and buzzed hither and thither. Mighty forms could be seen moving upon the ground in the thick forest, while the bosom of the river wriggled with living things, and above flapped the wings of gigantic creatures, such as we are taught have been extinct through countless ages. So straight away we've had this super kind of grim, gritty, contemporary start. Okay, we've had some sort of weird, dodgy, I'm in love with this strange woman kind of action now. But it's exciting stuff. And all of a sudden, we know that we're through the looking glass and we're on this strange island with weird, beastie things. And Tyler is firmly in charge of this U-boat. And then we get an exciting creature attack. Poor German, referred to as the Bosch. By Tyler, it grabs one of the Bosch.
Yes, yeah. Disposable characters.
Yeah, so he's a bit full of himself, as we learned from him taking command of the U-boat, yearning for the only female character and suspecting her of foul deeds because she talked to a German, baiting his comrades by calling them cowards.
Let's not forget here that conveniently as well, this character comes from a family that builds submarines.
Of course,
we forgot to mention that's another striking coincidence here, that he runs into the very submarine that he helped design. I think that was what was said, in the middle of the ocean. So he knows exactly what to do with it once he takes it over. That's
right. Yeah, I forgot about that, and that's something that carries through to the film as well, isn't it? With Doug McClure,
yeah,
it's like I think at one point he spots the conning tower and says, "Oh yeah, I know that. We make them in our shipyard." So the suggestion is that these submarines, that the U-boats, were actually made by an American shipyard company.
Right.
Bowen Tyler, U-boat expert. But the alpha male thing is definitely a strong feature of the pulp era. And it definitely demonstrates again when the U-boat does come under the attack from the sea creature and takes the poor Bosch. So it's all action. Taylor's firmly in charge. And we find out just in charge shortly afterwards in what, to all intents and purposes, turns out to be probably what we could describe as, let's charitably describe it as the anthropology chapter. Whilst on a game hunt, and after they've agreed to work together as one crew, with Germans and British and Americans working together, with Tyler at the top of the chain and in command, of course, Tyler and co happen across a clearing full of primitive hominids, some of which Tyler immediately recognises as the so-called Neanderthal man of La Chapelle aux Saints. Smart ass. He's a smart ass as well, and he reads his archaeological journals, his anthropological journals, apparently. So after musing on the makeup of this varied band of species types, we have some are little more than ape men, others are more biologically advanced and are bearing weapons. And after shooting a few, they take a Neanderthal because they come under attack. They don't just shoot them randomly. They come under attack, they shoot a few of them, and they take a Neanderthal captive and head back to the U-boat, where they're set to on camp work. But we find out something of the nature of the German U-boat captain, as well as Tyler, and potentially Burroughs' attitude, because I did read that he was, when it came to different races, he was very, very down on Germans, Japanese, and Arabs for some reason.
Okay.
So quite apart from all the racism in the Tarzan
and
books,
everybody else, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. I think he was all right with the English.
It was a little aside. He claimed to be descended from nobility or aristocracy, and he genuinely believed that there was an elite sort of genetic component to the British aristocracy, that they were, the sort of born to rule, eugenics type of thing. And so he was very much a subscriber to that, and that probably people use that to justify their own sense of self-importance, and so he was doing that with his admiration for the British upper classes.
Yeah, not the German upper class, as evidenced by this paragraph. One of the men threw to his rear a small branch that he had just chopped off, and as misfortune would have it, it struck von Schoenwartz across the face. It couldn't have hurt him, for it didn't leave a mark, but he flew into a terrific range, shouting, "Attention!" in a loud voice. The sailor immediately straightened up, faced his officer, clicked his heels together and saluted. "Pig!" roared the Baron, and struck the fellow across the face, breaking his nose. I grabbed von Schoenwartz's arm and jerked him away before he could strike again, if such had been his intention, and then he raised his little stick to strike me. I love that, his little stick. So he's got a swagger stick, but to Tyler it's just a little stick. It's so dismissive. An alpha. He raised his little stick to strike me, but before it descended, the muzzle of my pistol was against his belly, and he must have seen in my eyes that nothing would suit me better than an excuse to pull the trigger. Like all his kind, and all other bullies, von Schoenwartz was a coward at heart, And so he dropped his hand to his side and started to turn away. But I pulled him back, and there before his men, I told him that such a thing must never occur again, that no man was to be struck or otherwise punished other than in due process of the laws that we had made and the court that we had established. All the time the sailor stood rigidly at attention, nor could I tell from his expression whether he most resented the blow his officer had struck him, or my interference in the gospel of the Kaiser breed. Nor did he move until I said to him, "Plesser, you may return to your quarters and dress your wound." Then he saluted and marched stiffly off towards the U-33.
British justice. Always fair, always,
That passage actually reminded me of when I was a kid. When you're a kid, there are all sorts of books on shelves and hanging around, and sometimes when you're a reader, you find a book in a corner or something. Or my dad was a builder, so sometimes he'd come back from houses that he'd been doing building work on, and there'd just be some books that had been left behind, and he'd bring them back, books and records and all sorts of weird things that people would leave behind when they moved, or just throw in skips and things like that. And one of them was a book called Britain's Modern Army, and it was like a book about the army, but probably published around about 39 or 40, very, very early in the war, because, there was big sections on how the boys' anti-tank rifle was excellent for taking down German armour and all these different things. And there's a passage in it about bayonet practice. And the passage reads something along the lines of, "There's nothing the German is more afraid of than cold steel, because at heart he is a coward." And this paragraph reminded me of that.
Germans have no pluck. Zero pluck. And no decency as well, right? Because we know the British have the market cornered on decency.
Oh, it's absolutely incredible. But of course, a lot of these, obviously you're going to get lots of propaganda. This is a time when, people were being asked to volunteer, people were being drafted. Obviously a book like this is going to be like that. But have you ever seen a film called Went the Day Well? The screenplay was written by Graham Greene, and it was made quite early in the war, maybe 41 perhaps. And there's a lot of, for the time, famous British actors in it. And it's about a small town in the home counties somewhere. And some home guard turn up in the town and they basically take up residency in the church. But at one point, somebody is watching them write things down, and one of them writes a 7 with a stroke through the vertical line of the 7. And they go, "British people don't write 7s like that." And the twig that these are actually German paratroopers that have disguised themselves as home guard, and they're there to take over this strategic position in this village to assist the German invasion. And eventually they get rumbled. And I think it's Thora Hird. To some extent, you enjoy your British TV and stuff like that. You would know Thora Hird the moment you saw her. She was in dozens and dozens of films in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. She was in lots of sitcoms in the 70s and other films in the 80s.
The name rings a bell, yeah.
Yeah, and there's this scene where the village are about to fight back. They've sent a young lad out to try and contact the home guard down the road in a different town or village. He's been shot by one of the sentries, so he's staggered off through the forest and been found by the local poacher. So they're hoping that the home guard are going to turn up and save the day, or the actual army are going to turn up and save the day. And there's this scene where the Germans have basically thrown off their pretences now. They're still dressed as British soldiers. But one of them is in the kitchen at the post office, making sure that nobody can call out. And the woman who runs the post office is giving him a cup of tea and a slice of cake. And she says, "Oh, you seem quite nice, really. There's all these things we get told, like Germans putting babies on bayonets." And the German sat there eating a sandwich and he says, "Babies on bayonets? What would be the advantage?" It's absolutely amazing. And then she kills him with his bayoneted rifle from behind in a really shocking and brutal scene. It's an absolutely incredible film. And the headmistress saves children by throwing herself into a room and shutting the door, gets blown up by a grenade to save the children. It's
quite a piece of propaganda there, yeah.
Yeah, it's a crazy film and really quite shocking for a 1940s film that starts off like a slice of life, country life kind of film, then rapidly turns dark.
Yeah, the little English town is saved from Germans by a French 7, then is what you're saying.
Yeah, and the pluck of the locals Yeah, and that they identify the fifth columnist and bring him down as well. But whenever you see this stuff in like contemporary stuff that was written during World War One or at the end of World War One or World War Two, when you get these references to the cowardly and bullying Germans and their type, always takes me back to that stuff. Yeah. We also have an excellent example of the ERB hero's attitude to scoring with the ladies. This is just over the page from him humiliating von Schoenwertz. One by one, the others went to the rooms until the girl and I were left alone together, for I'd permitted the watch to go below for a few minutes. Knowing that I would be on deck, Miss LaRue was very quiet, though she replied graciously enough to answer whatever I had to say that required reply. I asked her if she did not feel well. Yes, she said, but I am depressed by the awfulness of it all. I feel of so little consequence, so small and helpless in the face of all these myriad manifestations of life, stripped to the bone of its savagery and brutality. I realise as never before how cheap and valueless a thing is life. Life seems a joke, a cruel, grim joke. You are a laughable incident or a terrifying one as you happen to be less powerful or more powerful than some other form of life which crosses your path. But as a rule, you are of no moment whatsoever to anything but yourself. You are a comic little figure hopping from cradle to the grave. Yes, that is our trouble. We take ourselves too seriously, but Caprona should be a cure for that. She paused and laughed. Now, at this stage, you would think, oh, that's a fair reflection on what a fucking horrendous time this girl has had over
That's
the
some
last...
good philosophy too there, yeah. You can't argue with it.
Over the last few days. So, Tyler's response is, you have evolved a beautiful philosophy, I said. It fills such a longing in the human breast. It is full, it is satisfying, it is ennobling. What wondrous strides towards perfection the human race might have made if the first man had evolved it and it had persisted until now as the creed of humanity. And at first when I'm reading that paragraph, I'm thinking, fuck's sake, Tyler, just steady on. But she realises just being a dick. And he says, I don't like irony, she said. It indicates a small soul. What sort of soul, then, would you expect from a comic little figure hopping from the cradle to the grave? I inquired. And what difference does it make anyway, what you like and what you don't like? You are here but for an instant, and you mustn't take yourself too seriously. It's amazing, really. You see, when you get, social media culture where somebody passes a fairly flippant observation or even a fairly, poignant piece of philosophizing about, the state of being, and then you get somebody who takes it personally and shits on them in a comment. That's exactly what Tyler does with poor Miss LaRue.
Is it ruining his sweet talking, all that philosophy? He doesn't want to talk about that stuff.
Yeah.
He doesn't want her to show a intelligence of her own, I don't think.
So she looked up at me with a smile. I imagine that I am frightened and blue, she said, and I know that I am very, very homesick and lonely. There was almost a sob in her voice as she concluded. It was the first time she had spoken thus to me. Involuntarily, I laid my hand upon hers where it rested on the rail. I know how difficult your position is, I said, but don't feel that you are alone. There is one here who would do anything in the world for you, I ended lamely. She did not withdraw her hand, and she looked up into my face with tears on her cheeks, and I read in her eyes the thanks her lips could not voice. Then she looked away across the weird moonlit landscape and sighed. Evidently, her newfound philosophy had tumbled about her ears, for she was seemingly taking herself seriously. I wanted to take her in my arms and tell her how much I loved her, and had taken her hand from the rail and started to draw towards me, when Olsen came blundering up on deck with his bedding. Oh, cock-blocked by Olsen and a blanket. Ugh. But what the fuck would Tyler done if he was in a mixed-sex class as a teenager? His fucking brain would have exploded, wouldn't it? My God.
These days we have a name for that behavior, Mr. Tyler. That's coercion. He's trying to coerce her into loving him.
Yeah, being a fucking creep.
Put your hand here, put your hand there, very slowly.
Yeah, just being an outrageous creep.
Yeah.
But you know what? It's working for him in this book. He gets there in the end.
It does by the end, yes. So they get to live there, maybe forever in bliss. It's implied, although we learn that's not the case in the second book. But
well, certainly in the film, that's the case. I don't know if Susan Penn-Halligan couldn't come back or something, but that flippant line in the film that just says, "Oh, she got thrown in a volcano or something." It's like, oh, poor Lisa. Oh, what a disaster. At this point, the book switches very suddenly into like a full diary account now, complete with dates. I wonder if he was writing this on the fly. He probably was, given how productive he was. But now it goes
into deadline.
Yeah,
to meet a deadline.
Yeah, now it goes into proper diary mode. But and we get some very rapid exposition. It turns out the Neanderthal they captured has a name and a rudimentary language, which is discovered by Miss LaRue. Had to laugh at her name. She's referred to as the girl most of the time in this account, but her full name sounds like a burlesque dancer, Lise LaRue. And he's called Arm, and they spend weeks building a small town, settling in, and he helps them to hunt. And he calls them Galu. Suggests that one day he expects to be Galu, suggesting that there's some kind of accelerated evolution at play, which would explain the mixed group of hominids. The film does a little bit more with this. I think it does less with the overall concept, but there's a little bit more involving Lisa, as she is in the film, in actually being able to figure this stuff out, because she seems like smart and switched on, and she's the one who is spending time with Arm and trying to figure this stuff out.
Well, she's a biologist or something in the movie. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Gave her an actual profession.
Yeah, and Doug McClure doesn't moon over her. So all of that weird, uncomfortable creeping stuff is completely gone. We learn that occasionally hunting parties go out and see groups of the primitives, but at one point the party are sure they saw a white man amongst these primitives. Where could this be going, I wonder? Oh, well, we'll find out. As Arm suggested that more humans are on the island, the Englishman Bradley leads a small expedition to look for signs. Arm goes missing, and von Schoenwartz and the Germans have discovered a source of oil, so they set up a refinery. And there's a much more passage of time in this than in the film. It all happens very quickly in the film, but in this they're there for weeks and weeks and weeks. They essentially build a small town. But to cut a long story short, even though it's not a long story, because now we're in diary mode, all this exposition takes place over a very short period of spell of pages. But I was expecting some kind of payback to this mini little arc that had been created with Tyler and, was it Presser, the German soldier who got struck by von Schoenwartz. But yeah, we don't get it, because actually what happens is they fool the English into thinking everything's all right, and they fuck off back to the U-boat and start shelling the town. And while this is all happening, police gets kidnapped. The book suddenly accelerates to a really rapid close at this point, but there's still a little bit more exposition, a little bit more stuff about this, how the island works. And it all goes a bit early 20th century theories of human evolution and racial stratification. What did you make of this part where he finds these more advanced humans and they all come from a pool of goo? I think that's the suggestion, isn't it? That there are no children, that they
it's suggested and then they metamorphose.
Yeah.
Because everything, it's not just accelerated evolution. It's things are metamorphosing from one form to the next, and so that's why Aum, or whatever his name is aspiring to be a Galu, which is the highest form, which is sort of like a Cro-Magnon or something like that. How this fits into racial theories of the time, and I mean, it's not as obvious in this book as it is in some of his other works or other people's works of that time, but clearly ending up being the whitest and most gentlemanly possible biped that you can be is what everyone's aspiring to as they metamorphose. Yeah. And when you really, we're not talking about the film yet, but you really notice that sort of thing, how icky it is once you see it on a screen. And like, what does the primitive man look like? Oh, well, his skin tone's going to be a certain thing, right? And so, yeah, I mean, it's a bit muddled in this one because of this metamorphosis concept, but it's definitely sort of a racial theory in which, modern man, a modern particular kind of modern man, is the end goal. Nature's goal is, Tyler, essentially.
Yes, that's right. So we've got this thing where they don't just develop physically, but intellectually. Their social levels of sophistication improve, and this all happens within a lifespan. And as they do so, they feel more drawn to move geographically as well into the island, almost like salmon moving upstream. And there's a bit further on where Tyler says he's going to go back, and he points in the direction. They say it's like back to the beginning. And so moving close to the edge of the island, their view was going back to the beginning, like almost moving backwards in in their
the
in their
more
development.
developed species live at the north end, apparently.
Yeah,
The south
so
end is where they
almost
start.
like salmon moving upstream to eventually be with the Galu. But there's a definite suggestion here that as they advance, as they metamorphosize into a more advanced form, that they go from ape man to Neanderthal to, in inverted commas, negroid features, then negroid features with white features. So they gradually turn white and then lose the negroid features. So the suggestion is that people of black ancestry, or black people in general, are less evolutionary advanced than Bowen Tyler and the people of
Which is definitely
Oakford, Illinois.
Definitely something Burroughs would have believed. I think he even wrote a couple of pamphlets about it. That's how, nonfiction pamphlets that he was, and that was, not to digress again, but it was very, very common in America by the 20s, all the way through the 30s and up until the Second World War. Eugenics was popular in the UK, but it became more popular in the United States with what's the name? The fellow who wrote the pamphlet that was an influence on Mein Kampf. I mean, it was Americans who were driving that sort of racial theory. So Burroughs was very much in a part of a cultural mainstream of that time with the development of American nativism and things like that. So it's no surprise to see that.
And he wasn't only in the middle of it culturally. He lived at the time when he was writing these early books in Oak Park, Illinois, which was an actual sundown town.
Right.
So a town referred to as a sundown town because if you're black, don't be caught there after sundown. And while he's living there, and this might be a pure coincidence, but while he's living there, in those early books, Tarzan hangs black African men from tree branches with vine leaves. And at one point introduces himself as the killer of many black men. Blimey. On the other hand, when you read about some of this stuff, there are a lot of people who are prepared to defend him, and I think in the Mars novels, John Carter, who could equally be judged to be like an Edgar Rice Burroughs proxy or Avatar or whatever, spends most of his time uniting the diverse colours of the people of Mars and pursuing a utopia after falling in love with a red woman who's born from an egg. And in the lore of Barsoom, the black race of Barsoom, the black men of Barsoom are considered historically the most advanced, and the red people of Deja Thoris are arguably yet more advanced socially and culturally, because the suggestion is that their heritage is mixed blood from other races, including the black men of Mars. I mean, he's writing these a little bit older, but I don't know. Is there a movement in his attitudes over time as more knowledge of race and evolution becomes more widely available? I don't know. I've no idea. But you can't escape from the fact that when you're reading this, you're like, at times you're thinking this, when we read War of the Worlds, we were like, holy shit, this could have been written 10 years ago. Because it's so easy to read and reads as so contemporary. But you read this and occasionally you do come to a screeching halt and say, holy shit.
It should be pointed out that Wells, it wasn't just, mainstream or right-wing people at that time. Wells was a fan of eugenics as a concept as well, because it was an intellectual fad, and many, many prominent people thought this was the next scientific innovation, the next scientific discovery.
Yeah, if you read his short history of the world, there's some slight eyebrow-raising moments when you read that as well.
It's easy, it's a tough debate, and it's easy to resort to man of his timeism about that sort of thing, and to sort of dismiss these things, and then we don't have to discuss it if we do man of his timeism. But the fact is, there were men at that time who did not subscribe to these viewpoints. It wasn't like they were universal. So the individual had a choice as to what they believe. So it's worth noting. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about this book right now. We're talking about Lovecraft or Ashton Smith, because they all had these sorts of elements in them.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
We pointed out to people, and we indicate that we disapprove, and that's the best we can do.
Yeah, stuff like this. These are cultural artifacts as well as adventure novels. They're snapshots of moments in time and how people thought. And if you stop reading stuff like this and dismiss it and throw it aside, you very soon forget that those attitudes existed.
Well, the majority of people in America, for example, do not know that for about a 20 to 30 year period, American racial theory was every bit as evil as Nazi Germany in some ways. So this is a historical document that says, this is the sort of things people believed back then. Yeah. And we need to remember that, because it's coming back. Yeah. Right? We see it everywhere now.
It's also really incredible when you think about it, how these things come full circle. That the TV series of the book Lovecraft Country is probably as responsible as anything currently for actually raising the profile of the knowledge of things like sundown towns even existing to a lot of people in America today. Because when that series came out, I think that was quite alarming for a lot of people, because I think, is that the series where the first episode? No, that it was the Watchmen TV series, wasn't it? So you had Lovecraft Country, which raised the prospect of sundown towns being a thing, because the central characters are all black. So it's an interesting book, Lovecraft Country, and I wasn't that keen on the TV series, to be honest. I thought it went too far down the CGI monster route, which the book isn't really. The book's much more suggestive. And I think the fact that in the book the sundown towns were the real horror, whereas in the TV series the sundown towns are juxtaposed with CGI monsters.
It definitely became a creature feature by the second episode.
Yeah, which I think was a shame, because it diluted the actual raw horror of just what those places were like if you were the wrong colour. And then the Watchmen TV series that Damien Lindelof did, that was responsible for bringing to attention something a lot of people didn't know about. I can't remember the name of the town, but it was a town where there was basically a massacre of black people in the 1950s, I think. And that the first episode revolves largely around that. And so, yeah, it's coming from, this kind of genre fiction comes full circle and actually becomes educational and raises the awareness of a lot of this stuff. I mean, it wasn't Lovecraft who wrote Lovecraft Country, but it was somebody who adored Lovecraft for the things that he enjoyed about Lovecraft, but was quite happy and quite prepared to juxtapose that with a lot of the things that Lovecraft believed in, and
obviously for racialized people to read these works would be far more difficult emotionally than it would be for people like us, and so that's that's important for people to know that this content is there. But yeah, and it comes full circle because we learn from them. Lovecraft Country is a great example of that, because it turns it on its head. It says, here's the source material is like this, but we're going to turn this on its head. But while still retaining, as you say, some kind of affection for the better elements of that. So, yeah, I mean, that's probably the best way to handle it.
Yeah. And talking about it on a podcast as well, which obviously...
Oh, we're gonna fix all the problems for the world.
Yeah, let's get self-important for a second. Oh, no, we won't. We won't at all. Because Tyler now rescues Lise from some horny dudes, but ends up settling them with them for a time after they're accepted. So some horny dudes, turns out, have kidnapped Miss LaRue. One of them wants him to be his woman, so he promptly gets shot by Tyler, and then another one decides he wants some, so he shoots him as well. And at this point, these people who are slightly more advanced say, oh, well, okay, fair enough, you can kill any of us. So they end up settling with them. And confident that he can leave Miss LaRue safely with these people, he moves on to discover more of the mystery of the island and how things work. Still curious about the Galu. Finds the grave of one of Bradley's party along the way. We don't find ultimately what happens to Bradley in this book, because, of course, really it's 1/3 of the overall story. He hooks up with yet more advanced people who are getting whiter and losing the, inverted commas, Negroid features. But while they might be losing them, they are gaining wife-beating features as a characteristic. So Tyler duffs one up for it and makes him promise never to harm a woman again. So having learned a few things, he goes back to Lise but finds that the village is all fucked up and there's dead bodies and stuff. And then all of a sudden, the story sort of barrels to an end as he finds Lise being dragged up a mountain by one of the guys from the village who lost his wife to raiders, because it turns out in a throwaway line that these settlements raid each other for women.
The pacing at the end was racing along.
Yeah. It's like he's definitely right into a deadline at this point. And he decided he wanted Lise instead. Tyler objects, kills him. They go live in a cave as man and wife. She declares her undying love for him. Everything's worked out, so he puts his manuscript in a bottle, throws it off a cliff in the hope someone will find it. The end of The Land That Time Forgot. So yeah, it introduces these ideas, but of course we do know now. We do know that this is actually just 1/3. I've got my lovely yellow Golanx Gateway collection here. And I do have a copy of The Land That Time Forgot movie tie-in with Doug McClure on the cover on a shelf out there that my
Wow.
mate Yaki got me a few years ago. But the spine on that, I feared that if I read it, the spine would start to disintegrate, so I stuck with my gateway version. Which version were you reading from? Were you reading a digital version?
Yeah, from Gutenberg. It was cheating.
Yeah. Third part of the story, we do know that his manuscript is found and finds its way to his father, and a rescue is launched, the story of which is told in The People That Time Forgot, which we didn't read, but we did watch the film. More on that in a bit. Thoughts on The Land That Time Forgot by Edgar Rice Burroughs?
Well, as I said off the top, I mean, I certainly had not read much of Burroughs' work before, so I didn't know what to expect in terms of the quality of the writing. And yeah, it's a bit purple, like most writers of that period. But the writing is impressive. He has a gift for imagery. Like when you're reading that passage about when they first encounter the pool and the life around it, you can really visualize that sort of thing. So, he was clearly quite skilled. I find the concept, even for that period, a little ridiculous. The idea that I like the lost continent idea. I like the lost earth idea. The idea that everything is metamorphosing at some massive rate, and everything, all kinds of animals from all eras are living at the same time in the same place. I found that a little bit silly, to be honest, even for that kind of science fiction. Yeah. And on all these things we're laughing about with the character and his macho, his early 20th century machismo, and the way the woman is treated, and the way the Germans are very much cardboard cutout figures. It was a fun adventure, but I would not call this, a classic. That's my my Robert Christgau evaluation of this. It's a C-.
Yeah. The merciful thing about this is you could knock this off in a couple of hours on one afternoon.
Which I did. Yes.
Sat in a garden chair. As pulp goes, this is some of the better and more readable and easy to just rattle through stuff, and it's quite pulse-pounding at times. And there were some bits in there that I think were quite surprisingly effective, mainly the stuff early on, before he really starts to put his foot down and rattle through it.
The war's plot was really good. I thought everything, and then once we get into look, dinosaurs, then I start to lose a little bit of interest. And I was happy to see that, and this is a trait he shares with Lovecraft. He tries to put in enough contemporary science in there to sort of convince you, because Lovecraft is full of that. You win people over with all these mundane scientific facts, but then the actual horror from beyond comes, and it's our science doesn't understand any of this. So that's all. It's part of how they brew up the tension, and this is similar in that way. So there's all kinds of early 20th century paleontology thrown in there, and it was good fun for that reason.
Yeah. Let's talk about the film then. Now, I mentioned before that this was a staple for me as a kid. Had you seen the film before?
I hadn't, no.
So the film was new to you. So, scripted by Moorcock and Cawthron, based upon the story, obviously. So if you're going to adapt that book, which, as we've commented, is a pretty uneven affair in terms of pace, and even by 70s standards, when they're writing the screenplay for this, definitely features the odd questionable element. How do you think they did?
I thought they did quite well, particularly in comparison with the sequel, and also with a lot of the sort of low budget monster movies that were released from the 50s through the late 70s. You can tell that these are people of intelligence who are trying to draw something meaningful, like actually meaningful out of this story, which of course Moorcock would. And, he didn't have a lot to work with there, to be honest. So the little touches like Lisa being, despite the historical setting, her being an actual biologist and someone that the men have to respect. And, I forget how she acquits herself in terms of the action. I mean, there's a lot of protecting of her that goes on.
Yeah.
I mean, this is still the 1970s, and that's just how things were.
Yeah.
But she's a confident figure. She's pretty unflappable. So, and we know that Michael Moorcock is a lifelong feminist. There's been many, many statements made to that effect. So I'm not surprised that he would make an effort to do that. And I thought making the Germans a little more human, less cardboard cutout, making Schoenwurz almost like pretty much an equal to Doug McClure's character. There's a bit of a pissing contest between them, but they're both men of honor in the end, mostly until the betrayals. But there's those dynamics were improved. It's a more subtle treatment of the topic. The caveman, well, I mean, it's a very typical depiction of a caveman. But again, what we're learning now about these prehistorical societies is changing all the time. So that was the image that you would have had of a Neanderthal or, you know, an early civilized man at that time. That was very contemporary. So I can't hold that against them. So on the whole, I thought it was an entertaining adaptation. I mean, I got to be quite honest. I understand there are aficionados of this kind of film, and clearly you're one of them. So the special effects are hard for me to get past in any film. And I know that they're done to certain budgets. I know that certain technologies didn't exist. But when you can kind of see the wooden pterodactyls, wooden jaws clacking, and you know, it's a bit hard to take. I was actually impressed with some of the landscape scenery. So let's say when they're depicting the U-boat on the water, and you could tell that it's water in a tank and that it's actually a little model of a U-boat. But I still bought it. You know, like I was drawn in. But it's when they have to show, you know, the animals and things like that, then, you know, it's kind of hard for me to take that seriously. And I know that there are aficionados of that kind of thing, and that it's kind of snobby to disdain it for some of those elements, but I do have a hard time getting past that. But for what it was, I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I think even by 70s standards, when you've been exposed to Ray Harryhausen dinosaurs, they're always going to struggle with those dinosaurs, because Ray Harryhausen was doing stop motion animation in the
of course, and
50s,
I remember
60s,
watching.
70s.
I remember watching. Oh, what was the famous one from the early '80s? One of his last films,
Clash of the Titans.
Clash of the Titans. When I was a child, and being, you know, really drawn to like the Medusa scene, for example. Like, so obviously the stop motion stuff was kind of the high tech animation of the era. Yeah. But in something like this film, it's all just sort of like, let's build some models and then we'll flash from one scene to the other, and it still beats bad CGI, mind you, which we'll
absolutely
also get
it
to.
does.
But,
Absolutely it does. Hands down.
I was entertained by this, and I liked it a lot more than I thought I would.
I think there were three methods for doing dinosaurs in those days. There was get Ray Harryhausen. There was some where they glued things to the back of monitor lizards or whatever and filmed them with a slow cranked camera to make them appear bigger and more menacing. That was terrible. And the middle ground was chunky model work, like The Land That Time Forgot. I think where the Land That Time Forgot really makes up for that is, you just alluded to the submarine, the model work and miniatures, the matte paintings, the lighting in some of the sets. When the submarine is trying to escape at the end and the island is essentially on fire, that all looks terrific. I think it looks great. The stuff at the beginning, obviously we don't have the same level of disturbing imagery as you do in the book, but the stuff at the beginning with the U-boat, I think looks just as good as the stuff in Das Boot from the early 80s, which was also models in tanks. I think it looks great. I think it's pretty well shot. I think Kevin Connor...
Yeah, there was some very good cinematography and scene work, And I should mention also, for what the kind of movie it is, I thought the acting was perfectly fine.
Yeah, I think it's good.
They're dashing characters, of course they are. But
yeah, I mean, Doug McClure was a B-movie actor, but he did what he did very, very well. I only really know Doug McClure from these films, but he was apparently in a lot of third-rate westerns, in a lot of American TV shows, which I'm not really aware of. To me, Doug McClure is the guy in these Amicus movies, and I think it's great. I think he's really charming. I think he's got charisma. I think he looks like he can handle himself action-wise, and that's really all you want.
Definitely, like William Shatner almost, yeah.
Yeah, and you compare him to Patrick Wayne in People That Time Forgot. Well, it's like night and day, isn't it? It's like night and day. But yeah,
McClure was the best thing about the sequel, actually. Yes.
Yeah, you've got a committed cast. You've got a crisp screenplay that does everything very economically but fairly effectively. It still all kind of tends to end fairly quickly, but I think Kevin Connor was really the director. He was a journeyman director. He was a workman-like director, and he obviously knew what he was doing with a film like this, which is why they kept on using him. Because although he did direct the sequel as well, we should point out, for better or for worse, and he also did the other two big Doug McClure Amicus monster mashes in the 70s, At the Earth's Core, also an Edgar Rice Burroughs film, the first Pellucidar novel. But perhaps my favourite, because I saw it at the cinema at aged about 7, in a double bill with Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. So I think Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger was the B feature. Oh, it might be the other way around, I can't remember. It was a double bill, and it was Warlords of Atlantis. Now, if I can find a file of Warlords of Atlantis, I'm going to send you a Dropbox link, because that was possibly the greatest cinema-going experience of my childhood. Similar kind of thing. Doug McClure aboard a boat. They get attacked by a giant octopus. They get pulled down into a vortex. And they end up washing up on a shore, and essentially they're in Atlantis. I
do love an Atlantean story.
Oh, and the great thing about Warlords of Atlantis is there is a monster that they're in this city that's constantly under attack from these huge monsters, and they pull people down from the surface to use them as slaves, and to rebuild the walls to defend the city. It's my favourite of all those films, and it was an original screenplay as well. It wasn't based on Edgar Rice Burroughs. I love it. Can't get enough of it. There is a novelisation out there by someone called Paul Victor, but sadly it's like rocking horse shit. But, it's a great film, so I'm going to send you a link to that, and if you get time at some point when you've got a boring afternoon, stick Warlords of Atlantis on, because it's a cracker. And
will do.
The other thing this film improves, I think, is the Germans, because they're not just racial stereotypes. I think von Schoenwurz is like a professional soldier at the beginning, but he comes round.
Subtle character, yeah.
He's cultured, He's we do have one nasty German, who I think they do have a nasty German to substitute. So the split von Schoenwurz in two, really. So we have Anthony Ainley playing a nasty German, who is an invention of the script. And then even he's not as big a prick as the captain in the book, although he still does, they do successfully dump Tyler and Lisa at the end and sail off without him, so maybe he is. But he's not a posh prick.
You have to have an antagonist, so they made one up. Yes.
Yeah. And the fight that he has with the British seaman is quite funny as well.
Yes. It's a schoolyard fight.
Yeah. Anthony Ainley, well known to British TV watchers, because he played the second iteration of the Master in Doctor Who. Yeah, factoid.
I thought that I knew I recognized him.
Yeah,
and that's it, because my sister and I were huge Doctor Who fans when we were kids. So.
Yeah, so late Tom Baker and through Peter Davison on to the end, Anthony Ainley was the Master with his little goatee beard. Although Doctor Who fans will listen to this and are now going to go, oh, well, actually, in The Deadly Assassin, there was another guy who played the Master, but when he was in his emaciated state. But I don't count him, because you never saw his face.
No,
he
that creeped me out. Oh, yeah. When I was a kid, that really creeped me out, that one.
Yeah. Yeah, well, cheap makeup, but good makeup. Effective makeup, I thought. So, obviously, the end of the book's quite abrupt, so they need something more of a climax and a build to it, so what better? Volcano. Jettison the racial theories and the wife beating. Give us a volcano to enhance the peril, and give us a ticking clock. And I think that works. I think it hits all the beats of the book. In some ways brings a bit more to the table, as we've mentioned with Lisa and von Schoenwurz. And all told, I just love that Amicus made these films. It's so much of the British genre scene of the 60s and 70s is dominated in the public consciousness by Hammer and the conversation around Hammer.
Right.
But Amicus were one of those studios. There was a few, Tygon and a few others, but Amicus were at it consistently. They were doing horror portmanteaus. They were doing the Doctor Who films with Peter Cushing, these Doug McClure, Edgar Rice Burroughs specials. Milton Subotsky and the other guy who were behind it were really trying to do exciting, colourful genre cinema for families. And I think it's only because Star Wars ruined that special effects school for younger audiences by raising expectations that this kind of stuff kind of collapsed. But we also know that the quality maybe never stayed quite the highest, which brings us to The People That Time Forgot, which we also watched. So this is it's not in any way as faithful an adaptation as Land there was.
No, it completely veers off into, distasteful territory.
Yeah.
in my opinion.
It's something of a fix-up from elements of those two novels, but I think it draws more on... When I was watching it, I was just thinking, this is just the plot of Beneath the Planet of the Apes.
Yeah. Or any number of other kinds of those, TV shows and movies of that period. When you get to the women being sacrificed to the volcano, there is no more hackneyed convention, in that kind of film. The beautiful girls must be sacrificed. Yes. Yeah. And of course, there's this big green bald man who groans and he's the leader, I guess, of this Galu. I guess this is the Galu. I think it is.
Yeah. So
but the rest of whom all wear masks. Yeah.
Yeah. The ultimate metamorphosis is into a bald ex-wrestler painted with silvery green makeup. That is the ultimate form of the people.
He just snarls, and he's got this little like monkey-like familiar, like this, like a Grima Wormtongue type character who's just hanging around him, or like like Jabba the Hutt, that sort of thing. He's got his little entourage.
I thought that was Deep Roy at first, but it isn't apparently.
Just so stereotypical in every aspect.
So
and just
I was curious.
The tone of it overall it's got this jauntiness that is lacks the some of the gravity of the first film. There's too much joking around. I thought the addition of the girl from she was in Superman 2, I think, was her most famous role. She was one of the bad Kryptonians.
Sarah Douglas.
She was an interesting addition because that was another sort of stronger, more action-oriented female character. That was an attempt to counterbalance the fact that this contained another element that I found ridiculous, is this Raquel Welch lookalike wearing skins that showed off about 3/4 of her breasts, because a savage is, of course, going to show off as much of her breasts as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I know it's very typical, particularly of the 1970s, that look where they had her feathered sort of curly hair that could have been done at an island salon. And just ridiculous stuff. And she's got a full face full of makeup on, even though she's a savage.
Yeah.
It's stuff like that. It was just ridiculous. Honestly.
Well, weirdly, Dana Gillespie, who plays that role with her bosoms on show, I also saw her recently in another Mysterious Island movie that Hammer made called The Lost Continent, not so long ago, which is like a Sargasso Sea kind of thing, where weird creatures and giant crabs and terrible killer weeds have got all these ships trapped. And that's more about, like, it's a weird combination of pirates and the Spanish Inquisition. It's actually quite an interesting film, but she's in that as well. Also, with her boobs conspicuously on show.
I mean, and I should point out again, like, this is not a genre that I've spent a ton of time with. And so if you've watched enough of these things, you probably just learn to laugh and say, well, that was just of the time, and shrug that stuff off. Whereas I look at it and I go, oh my God, this is absurd. I'm not inured enough to some of those elements to be able to appreciate the other good stuff that might be going on as well, right? You have to be able to look past some of these things, and I have difficulty.
Yeah. She's an interesting character, Dana Gillespie, as well, because she's actually a folk artist. And she's still creating music to this day. Yeah.
Well, I'll have to look that up.
She did an album in the 70s that was produced by Bowie and Mick Ronson. Yeah. She was intimately involved with Bowie in the late 60s from the age of 14. She was the original Mary Magdalene in the first run of Jesus Christ Superstar. And she's still recording and putting out work now. Although I did look her up, and her latest is a collaboration with a generative AI company to create a Eurovision entry for San Marino. So make of that what you will. But that was her second misstep in her career, and this was the first one.
The
other point about Sarah Douglas, who I adore Sarah Douglas. I can't get enough of her. She just did so much genre cinema. Not only she's in Conan the Destroyer as the evil queen, did lots of stuff. Of course, she's Ursa in Superman 2. But Moorcock connection, she was Catherine Cornelius in the final programme film from the 70s.
Which I still have not managed to see, because it's very hard to get a hold of that.
So she played Jerry Cornelius' sister. Yeah. So nice little Moorcock connection there. And one of the interesting things was, who originated those Princess Leia buns? Her or Princess Leia?
I noticed that she had the buns, yeah.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be a demure style, I guess, for her character. But by the end of the movie, that hair is down.
Oh, it is.
So that she could be more attractive to us.
Yeah. Turns out this was filmed at Pinewood round about the same time as Star Wars was shooting at Pinewood. Coincidence?
Yes. Well, I saw that in the credits, yeah.
Who knows? And that's not the only Star Wars connection with the people at Time Forgot as well. So the second in command aboard the ship, Mr. Whitby, is played by a guy called Richard Le Parmentier. And he's the same guy that famously gets choked by Darth Vader at Grand Moff Tarkin's board table. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Don't try and frighten us with your sorcerer's ways, Lord Vader.
Yeah.
And
that was a good bit.
David Prowse, Darth Vader himself, is the evil, bald villain's executioner with the axe. Yeah. More Star Wars connections. yes, this film is a bit rubbish. And I was thinking about it when I was watching it. I was thinking, I wonder who wrote this, because Moorcock wrote the first one. Is it just some journeyman who kind of knocked the script out for this? Turns out the script was written by Patrick Tilley. And I thought, Patrick Tilley, that name is really familiar. It turns out it's the Patrick Tilley who got some success in the 80s writing a series of sci-fi novels called The Amtrak Wars. And, I mean, he was in his 70s when he wrote these, but they actually made quite a bit of impact in the, the sci-fi fan network. I had no idea he was British, Patrick Tilley, but yep, he was British, and he was a graphic designer for some pretty striking book covers in the 60s, one of which I'll send you afterwards. It's a cracker. And he kicked off his sci-fi writing career, then went on to screenwriting. Passed away in 2020, sadly, at the grand age of 91. But I've got to say, Patrick Tilley, I think you took most of your cues from Beneath the Planet of the Apes. The entire setup in its basic form. So you've got the rescue mission for Taylor, stroke Tyler, another weird coincidence. Rescue mission goes, gets into similar kind of trouble, gets captured by the villains, ends up being put in a cell next to Taylor, stroke Tyler. Taylor, stroke Tyler escapes, goes down in a blaze of glory with a gun shooting the baddies. The only difference between this and Beneath the Planet of the Apes is in Beneath the Planet of the Apes, he destroys the entire world by triggering the apocalyptic atom bomb. So in this, the entire world doesn't die at the end. Instead, everybody gets back to the ship. Shane Rimmer gets to put his hand on Dana Gillespie's hip and ogle her boobs. And there's like a weird, jerky, sort of perky ending.
Similar premise with the plane to, I know I keep mentioning it, but at the Mountains of Madness, when they're at the beginning, when they're going over that big ice wall, it's exactly the same premise. It goes on forever, and there's these unbelievably tall mountains. At that point, when I was watching it, I was thinking, well, this might not turn out to be too bad, because that was pretty impressive.
Nice model work, nice map paintings.
It was when it got to the castle and the man painted and the volcano. It's like, I can't handle this. Yeah,
I think some of the things that do work, I think it's, again, Kevin Connor's got a real knack for shooting things like model work and integrating it with some of the, location stuff. The location shooting's pretty good. There's some nice scale, some nice vistas.
Yes.
It does, but it feels more condensed down to the smaller ensemble. And because, Patrick Wayne's not great, and his sidekick is a guy who is well known from Hammer films and various stuff for being like a chirpy, mustachioed, British, sort of plucky professor type. There's no peril, really, even though it's got more scale. One of the things that sells the danger of the island in the first one is the steady attrition of the sailors and the German U-boat men. So it doesn't feel as perilous. There is some fun action, some swordplay, a volcano, but the scripts just can't match the... I won't say the first one is... I can't really say it's sophisticated, but it does a
intellectually you can.
Yeah, it does a sophisticated thing with what on the surface seems to be quite broad and lowbrow idea. One thing I will say though is when it comes to monster mashing, they do up their pterodactyl game from Land That Time Forgot. Much more impressive pterodactyl.
When they're attacking the plane, that was good fun.
Yeah. And there's something incredibly old school and satisfying about a 1920s flying boat being attacked by a pterodactyl, while Shane Rimmer blazes away at it with a Lewis gun.
And the people in the plane seem surprisingly unruffled by it, actually. So,
well, Patrick Wayne seems surprisingly unruffled by everything.
Yeah,
because it's just
that's one of the reasons why it doesn't work so well. Is, as you say, like there's never a sense, despite all the dangers facing them, that anything bad is actually going to happen. They're also treating it like an adventure.
Yeah,
and unconcerned about their own safety. In the end, one of them does die in a very grand, self-sacrificial way. But up to that point, there's no point where you think that things aren't going to work out perfectly for them.
No, and the fact that they go through all this effort just for Doug to go down in a blaze of glory and end up dying anyway is a bit disappointing. Doug really brings something to it when he turns up, just because he's Doug McClure. And he looks like he's an old pro. He's invested in this. He can do this stuff in his sleep, but he still looks more convincing than just about
He's
every
trying
other
to convey
male
something.
Character.
Yeah, the others aren't trying to convey anything at all, other than some very surfacey emotions.
Patrick Wayne's an interesting case, isn't he? Because he's the second son of John Wayne. Very square-jawed. Actually, physically, looks great. Handsome, square-jawed. Weirdly, when he talks, sounds more like Clint Eastwood than John Wayne. But
and he's no better an actor than his father was, and that wasn't very good. So.
An incredibly wooden Clint Eastwood, to be fair. But, it turns out he was in Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger the same year as well. But, of course, in Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, he's wearing a a turban type thing, and is slightly browned up with makeup to make him look Arabian. Yes. But I do always remember thinking the Sinbads in the Sinbad films were always really fucking bland. Never had any charisma or personality, and this explains it. I did wonder what happened to him, but he just stopped and became a TV host in the 80s. So, yeah, gave up acting to be a TV host. One more point to note about it. When they're in the throne room, in the villain's skull castle that looks like that's a poor matte painting, actually. It looks like something from He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. It looks like Castle Grayskull. It's particularly bad. But in the skull castle, he has Frank Frazetta's Death Dealer painting on his wall. So I was looking at it, I was like, hang on a minute. I was squinting at the screen. It was like, yeah, that's Frank Frazetta's Death Dealer. So they just got it blown up and framed it and put it on the wall of the villain. Yeah. Well, talking, law of diminishing returns, what else did we watch? Well, I don't know why it's fallen this way. As I said before, this is the second time we've done a C. Thomas Howell Asylum movie when we've been podcasting about something. And he directed this one as well. I don't know if he directed that War of the Worlds one, but he directed this. And I don't know if there's a hat trick in this at some point, but trust me, I'm going to Google it to find options. But yeah, how do we even talk about the C. Thomas Howell Land That Time Forgot film?
I don't even have a context for this kind of schlock, other than the War of the Worlds movie that we saw. As I said the last time we talked about C. Thomas Howell, I'm sure I have respect for him. I've seen him in films where he fits in perfectly well with a cast of good actors, so it's not that he can't act, but he seems to have a taste for this sort of, what would have been direct-to-video stuff, and now direct-to-streaming. He has a sort of taste for this stuff, and maybe it's the time that we live in, the 60s, 70s, you can have fun watching something that's not, technically very advanced and sort of low budget. But when you get to the 90s, and all these creature features look like episodes of Baywatch, there's no charm. No. It's like all the charm has been sucked out of it. The CGI is terrible. And CGI is something you can do well. It's something you can do terribly. It's terrible. The script is awful. It's not as bad as his War of the Worlds movie that he was in, where the script was a joke. It was like a comedy. The casting, I'm sure these people are fine actors, but when you put people in a situation like this, there's no way you're going to get a good performance out of them. It's a bit like with George Lucas's Star Wars sequels and prequels, where you put really fine actors like Natalie Portman and Ewan McGregor in this thing, and they look like they've never acted before because everything is just so terrible. Yeah, it's a bit like that. And again, there's things that people like me, who are unfair, I guess, notice. Like there's two women, both of whom, of course, are extremely beautiful in an American kind of way. Both of them have full faces full of makeup and nice hair. By the end of the movie, they still have the same makeup on. It hasn't run. It hasn't gotten smudged. Their hair is still perfect. But they're supposed to have gone through all these horrors. And it's just, I just can't handle that kind of thing. And Howell himself just sort of smirks his way through the whole thing, which is what he tends to do in this kind of material. And there isn't much of a plot.
Yeah.
One thing that they did to get around some of the questionable things about Burroughs and his ilk is they've removed the primitive people aspect altogether. And it's now just about people from different time periods getting stuck on an island together and having conflicts with one another, which isn't, with dinosaurs around, which to me wasn't interesting enough to carry the plot.
Yeah. No, it was bollocks, wasn't it?
I maybe gave it more analysis than I needed to. But.
Well, I'm going to go through through just a few bullet point observations about it. And when I looked this film up, it had a Google summary box that said, in a nutshell, wondrous, thrilling, and suspenseful. Right? So I thought, okay, we'll be the judges of that. So it's an Asylum film anyway, so you know what you're in for. Asylum being the studio behind the mockbusters like Transmorphers and all the other balls made for 10 bob and a pickled egg. I think I read that they make these films for about $200,000 and they knock them out in a month. And they want to get them out a couple of weeks before the major studio releases. So other examples of the mockbuster formula. So we've had War of the Worlds, obviously. We've got The Da Vinci Treasure. We've had I Am Omega, which came out just before I Am Legend, with I Am Omega because we had the Omega Man. So I Am Omega. Almighty Thor. How the hell they got away with that, I've no idea. a personal favourite, Atlantic Rim, which really sounds like it should be a porn parody.
Yeah.
Sinister Squad, Fast and Fierce Death Race, 2 for the price of 1 there, Triassic World, Tomb Invader, Top Gunner, that one's got Eric Roberts in it, and my favourite already, even though I haven't seen it, Moon Crash. They did a mockbuster of Moonfall, a film that nobody bothered to go to see. God bless them. God bless them. Moon Crash. I can't see... The problem is with asylum films, you think Moon Crash can't be any worse than Moonfall, but of course it can, because at least Moonfall was fucking funny. It was funny in its terribleness. And interestingly, with the Edgar Rice Burroughs connection, just before John Carter came out, they beat it to the punch with Princess of Mars, starring Tracy Lords as Deja Thoris, and something we will end up watching at some point, because we've had Princess of Mars lingering around the fringes of the itinerary for a couple of years, because we can't really do Moorcock's Cain of Old Mars trilogy without going back to the well. And of course they do shitloads of cheap creature features like the Sharknado series, 2-headed shark attack, 3-headed shark attack, 5-headed shark attack. I don't know why they skipped a number, either that or the Wikipedia list maker fucked up and missed one out. You had one job, mate. Nice one. Sand sharks, ice sharks, and brand new for 2024, which I now have to track down based on the name alone, Meth Gator.
You know, there was that one last year about the cocaine bear, so they're probably trying to take advantage of that.
The cocaine bear probably cost $60 million. You could probably... Asylum could make movies for 20 years on the on the budget of cocaine.
I have to admit, I did see a couple of Sharknado movies.
Yeah.
I did.
They became like a cultural phenomenon.
They did. So they were on TV one day, and I'm like, okay, let's see what this is all about.
Yeah. There's like 6
it was
of
what
them
I
now.
expected. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And they do
I'm
creature
not really
mashups.
I'm not really sure what the game is with this sort of thing. I mean, do you make money doing these? Like,
the guy who owns the studio says they have never lost money on a film.
I don't understand. I have to say. I guess it's fun. I don't want to, pee on people's good time, but
yeah.
I don't understand the appeal or how it works as a model. But if they say so, then
yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? He says they've never lost money on a film, so they make these films for about $200,000, and then they sell them to cable, they sell them to the Sci-Fi Channel, they put them out on streaming. And I've no idea what Sci-Fi Channel pay for something, because they must show them like umpteen times each. When I've turned the Sci-Fi Channel on from time to time, I must have seen Mega Shark versus Giant Octopus on there numerous times. So they obviously get their money's worth about filling their time schedule with them. Because, of course, they do the other creature mashups like Mega Shark versus Giant Octopus, Mega Shark versus Crocosaurus, Mega Python versus Gatoroid, which is an interesting sounding one. And weird casting stunts as well, like the ones had Tiffany and Debbie Gibson in the same movie.
That's one of the most interesting things about them is who's in this one that we remember from the 90s or something.
Yeah.
If enough people listen to this podcast who enjoy asylum movies, they're going to have a major hate on for me. They're going to hate my guts.
Well, you know what? If enough people listen to this and Asylum think, you know what, we're going to sponsor that podcast, I will take their money. I will run Asylum film adverts for Mega Python versus Gatoroid versus
I'll be
Meth
banned.
Gator.
I'll be banned from your show.
Yeah. The thing with Asylum movies is the order of the day is stripping out anything that could possibly involve production values. So take a small cast out into some fields or some beaches in California, stick in some terrible CGI monsters, and boom, jobs are good. And for this one, they even went to a fancy dress shop and got some period clobber for a World War II pilot.
Very unconvincing.
A leather pilot hat, anyway. Not much else. Yeah. And even at the fancy dress shop, they cheaped out big time on German U-boat crew costumes because they all just look like grubby mechanics they found down the street. We must point out, though, that the U-boat crew is there. Although they're there, they don't actually stretch the budget to a U-boat. They're just hanging around in a cave.
Hanging around wearing white shirts and
grubby white vests.
Yeah.
Although they do put a CGI U-boat in later for a beach shot when they demonstrate that they don't actually know how a torpedo works, which I did laugh at. When they fire a torpedo through the air at a CGI T-Rex, which was just incredible. But and you know what? I'm not a gun nut, but even I recognise an American M2 carbine when I see one. I mean, for fuck's sake, you're in California. You don't know anybody that could rustle up a vintage German rifle or submachine gun. I don't believe that's true for a second, even a deactivated one, because no Asylum budget actually stretches to blank firing guns anyway. The gunfire's all crappy After Effects plugins.
If Lemmy was still alive when they made this, I'm sure they could have asked him. I think he had a collection
Absolutely. Yeah.
Paraphernalia, yeah.
Yeah. And what makes it even more amazing is the using, I think it's called After Effects gunfire plugins. And even then, only about 1 in 8 gunshots actually has an After Effects plugin. And it's After Effects plugin. The rest of the time, the guys are just having to pretend. It's just terrible. So, other than C Thomas Howell, of course, the cast does bear some commentary because they're generally interchangeable. I like with any Asylum movie. But the captain of the pleasure boat that ends up rocking up on the island is Timothy Bottoms.
Yes. That I did notice.
Yeah. So, poor Timothy Bottoms. I was wondering, I found an interview with him from just literally a couple of months ago, right? The interviewer says, you've collaborated with filmmakers such as Dalton Trumbo, Peter Bogdanovich, Lewis Gilbert, Gus Van Sant, James Bridges, Philip Kaufman, Jan Troell, and many more. What's the biggest thing you've taken away from working with them? And Bottom says, the biggest thing, and I can only say this now, is the memories. From meetings to table reads to playing the scene, getting to know the cast and crew, the meals and good times, wonderful locations, fabulous hotels, so many interesting people. Some of the best people in the world are film people. It's like, I hope he had a good motel for The Land That Time Forgot, because it's not interesting locations, isn't it?
Working with the great C. Thomas Howell.
Yeah, and the interviewer also says, are there any particular filmmakers or actors you'd like to work with? And Bottom says, oh, sure, but it doesn't matter who I'd like to work with. In my case, it all depends on getting the offer to audition. Moving past the casting process and meeting with directors and producers, I'm not very good at that. Otherwise, working with a particular director or actor is just pie in the sky. I'll keep auditioning for projects if my manager can pitch me, and casting will give me a shot. Meanwhile, enjoying my life and folks I'm close to and just contemplating existence in this world is enough. But I continue to dream. My father called me his soaring dreamer. Life turns on a dime. It's a long journey, life, from Dalton Trumbo and Peter Bogdanovich to C. Thomas Howell's take for The Asylum on The Land That Time Forgot.
Well, you know, there was a time when Eric Roberts was a well-regarded actor too, so, you know, you never know who's going to turn up in these things.
Yeah, but I mean, you know what, it's a payday, he's still working, so good for him. And the other dude on the boat is an old compadre, C. Thomas Howell, who was in The Outsiders and Red Dawn.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah.
As a teenager as well, Darren Dalton, the wimpy class president guy in Red Dawn who gets mercilessly executed as a traitor by C. Thomas Howell's character. So thanks to his buddy, he's now an Asylum Films regular as well. So good for him. Stay working, Darren Dalton, even in garbage like this. He gets eaten by a T-Rex anyway, so, you know, good for him. Good for him. So final note and final weird connection, because we were talking about Dagon and Stuart Gordon earlier. One of Asylum's first movies they ever made was a really interesting and odd thriller called King of the Ants, directed by Stuart Gordon and written by Charlie Higson, based on his own novel. Charlie Higson from The Fast Show. You know, I know you watch British TV. I don't know if you ever watched The Fast Show, but Charlie Higson is really well known on British TV for doing a comedy sketch show with Paul Whitehouse and various other people. And yeah, he writes novels. Also wrote the Young James Bond novels. No, I don't really know anything about them, but apparently they've sold a lot of copies as well. Just seems really weird combination. Asylum Studios, Stuart Gordon, and Charlie Higson did a film called King of the Ants, which I saw a long time ago. Interesting movie. Bit weird. But yeah.
I'm sure it has something to do with ants.
Well, it's more a sort of I don't think there are actually any ants in it. It's not a monster film. It's a really kind of brutal and unpleasant crime thriller.
Oh dear.
Almost could have been a stage play. It's a cast of like 5 or 6 people. Yeah, interesting movie. Very intense and weird. Got one of the Baldwins in it. Daniel Baldwin.
One of the 5 Baldwins. Yeah. Daniel.
The chunky one, Daniel Baldwin.
Yes, the one from Homicide.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and he was also in Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man as the villain. That's the only thing I really remember him for outside of King of the Ants. Yeah. So anyway, that was The Land That Time Forgot. The book, the Amicus film sequel, and the C Thomas Howell version. So, any further observations about The Land That Time Forgot before I say thank you for suffering through this with me?
All I could say is C. Thomas, if you're ever in North Bay, Ontario to film a B movie, we have really good tax breaks up here for filming. So if you're ever up here, look me up. I will buy you a couple of pints in apology for all the hard times I've given you in this podcast.
You know what? There's an offer. There's an offer that surely you can't refuse.
You could even stay in my spare room because I know you probably have a low budget for your productions. But no, this was very interesting because as you know, you may have inferred, while I'm a big reader of the literature of that period, you know, particularly the sci-fi. You know, I love Ashton Smith, I love Lovecraft, William Hope Hodgson, Olaf Stapledon, David Lindsay is my big favorite. I love all the literature of that period, but Burroughs is not someone I'd spent a lot of time with, so this was a bit of a learning experience. I gained some appreciation for his work, for his, you know, as a prose stylist. I was horrified by some of his views. I saw a couple of movies that sort of are helping educate me about some of the, you know, the sci-fi of, you know, the era in which I was born, the 70s. So, you know, it was a learning experience for me, actually. So I appreciate that.
Well, good, and I'm delighted you joined me. And as you mentioned, William Hope Hodgson, I've had him on our Halloween poll 3 or 4 times out of the last 5 years, and I've always had The House on the Borderland on our Halloween poll, and it never gets voted in. But last year when we did Halloween, we had our Halloween poll, and then I just did another couple of Halloween movies just for the hell of it in October. So if you fancy doing The House on the Borderland or The Boats of the Glen Carrig, or...
Well, my upcoming publication begins, believe it or not, with an epigraph from Hodgson's epically long and mostly horrible The Nightland.
The Nightland.
So you know, I am capable of speaking of that. So that would be a fun show to do.
Well, in that case, you are the perfect guest to do William Hope Hodgson, perhaps in October if you're up for it. Late September or early October, perhaps. We'll have a think about it. We'll see if we can schedule something, because I really want to talk about William Hope Hodgson, because The Nightland was fucking hard work, but I do love The House on the Borderland. Is one of my favourite books of all time. And I'm a really big fan of The Ghost Pirates and The Boats of the Glen Carrig as well. Well,
yeah, those are good too.
If anybody's out there, Nightshade Press did some hardcover collections a few years ago that are really hard to get now and go for quite a few bob, but they actually released them in paperback, all 5 volumes, a couple of years ago. I think they're still out there. And Nightshade Press also did a 5-volume Clark Ashton Smith series as well. And I think they released them in paperback as well, after the hardcovers became hard to get. So it's all out there. But thanks again, and we shall reconvene later in the year to talk William Hope Hodgson.
We'll do that. Look forward to it.
Massive thanks to Allister for not only coming on to talk about The Land That Time Forgot, but also for sitting through another Asylum movie for the cause. You can find all of his music under his name and various guises, including Khan Tengri, The Gateless Gate, Sons of Birches, and Twilight Fields at thegatelessgate.bandcamp.com, and I will of course link to that page in the show notes. His novel, which we talked about here a couple of years ago, The Music of the Spheres, is available now, and we'll keep you posted on progress with his next one. As is traditional, we'll also play the show out with one of his tracks. This time, quite aptly, it'll be a cover of the Deep Fix song Dude's Dream, written by Michael Moorcock and original on the album New World's Fair. And thanks as always to our patrons for keeping this show on the road. First, those without tier: Anthony Piconti, Tim Cardos, Dave Dempster and Sebastian Weetabix, and our chaos engineers Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Spong, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Brandon Mays, Dan Charnley, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Gabriel Laycock, Harvey Faulkner Aston, Jim Kirkland, Jim Jupp, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Matt Saltz, Nelbert, Ophir Ziv, Paul McRandall, PJ Cooper, Scott Butler and Simon Perrins. And of course thanks to our crafty jugaderos Alexander Harris, Christian Hundal, Eliel Westenra, Liam Turner, Loz, Mark Taylor, Matthew Broom, Graham Holden and Toby White. And eternal thanks to our patron demons, Alistair Davison, Andy Clark, Andy Darby, David Lee, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Glenn Sawyer, Greg Faulkner, Gwen Barlow, Ian Stead, Imria, Jenny Stim, Jason Vogel, Joe Monty, Lee Gary, Mark Hebden, Marius Latauskas, Miles Reed-Labato, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, Tom Murphy, Tony Milazzo, the OG patron, Norman Beresford, and last but never least, Robert McMillan. Right, enough from me. Stay tuned for Dude's Dream by Sons of Birches, but in the meantime, don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. BITR Breakfast in the Ruins Radio is live on Radio Garden or via the web player at breakfastintheruinsradio.blogspot.com. We have our Patreon page too, and there are a few extra odds and sods on there. But for now, take care, stay safe, and we will meet again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.
Isn't it delicious? There's a red sun in the sky. Every time we see it rise, another city dies. And the bombs blow up the cemeteries, and the dead give up their graves. But we go on making out, babe, through the short, bleak days. And I really wish you'd tell me if your skin is feeling right. I don't like the way your shoulder peeled last night. And the bombs blow up the houses, and the bombs uproot the trees. And I saw my children carried off on a strange bright breeze. But there ain't no point in weeping, and there ain't no point in lying. Let's laugh and make the most of it. After all, we're only dying. Rolling, we're rolling in the ruins. Rolling, we're rolling in the ruins. Oh, we're rolling in the ruins, and we know we're bound to go. Since we found the doctor's surgery, I'm feeling rather fine. Send a shot of this and a shot of that up the old main line. And the bombs blow up the churches, and the priests cry out for faith. Kiss my mouth while I still have it. Take my hand and keep it safe. Hear my heart while it's still beating. Hear my breath while it can last. And take another road, dear, but we'd better make it fast. And the bombs destroy our hopes, and the bombs fragment our dreams, and we're bound to pause and wonder if all is what it seems. But there ain't no point in leaving, for there's nowhere left to go. Just smile and make it tender, make it kind and make it slow. Bye.